Appamada's programs and facilities are supported through your generosity. Your support really does make a huge difference. You'll find a link for contributions on the website at appamada.org/contribute. Thank you so much.
Vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction. Wearing the universal teaching, I realize the one true nature, thus harmonizing all being. Vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction. Wearing the universal teaching, I realize the one true nature, thus harmonizing all being. Vast is the robe of liberation, a formless field of benefaction. Wearing the universal teaching, I realize the one true nature, thus harmonizing all being. Okay, so let's do check-ins. I'm gonna start arbitrarily. Shelley, will you start us off?
I'm just working on sewing the frame to the silk side.
Great.
And I have a question about when you make the lines in the half, do you do the top line first or the middle line first?
So you've already attached the frame to the face.
Yes.
Wow, you've made a lot of progress. Have you been working based off the videos?
I have, and MarLa and I sewed for a little while together one day this week.
Very good, very good. Well, that's great to hear. Yeah, so you were asking about the order for the middle and the outside. So generally we work our way out. You do the middle first, because there's kind of some, if you've seen it in the videos, you kind of have to average out if there's a little bit of variance. One side is 4.4, one is 4.2. You know, how do you make it so that at the corners, how do you make it so that those lines meet here at that corner? How does this middle line meet this middle line? I think I always urge people that is the primary goal. The secondary goal is centering that middle line in between whatever that length is from there to there. But the primary goal, I think, is to making those corners meet. So definitely recommend doing it all in one go and making sure you're satisfied before beginning.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Rosemarie, how about you?
I have a problem that I need to share with you, so you might want to take me at the end.
Okay. What phase is it for?
Okay.
Just which, like.
Okay, just briefly, it was doing the knotless knot. It was all great. And then I pulled tight to try and snip as close so that it could not be seen. And it wasn't exactly not seen. There were a few little hairs sticking up. And this was the mistake, trying to pull back. And I pulled back from the point. And now I have a little loop there. And yeah, so I'm either going to have to redo the line, or a thought that I had, I don't know if it might be worth trying, is trying to put the tip of a needle into one of the stitches to see if I could take it out with tweezers and pull. I don't know, that was my only thought. So maybe you want to mull that over while you go with other folks. And
why don't I offer one suggestion now? And
yeah, sure.
See if it definitely requires some squinting and holding your tongue just right. But so thread a needle with a relatively short length of, if you have cotton, that would be perfect. Okay. You want something that doesn't slip too much, something that, so what we're going to try to do is we're going to thread this, and it's just a one short little loop, put it in through the hole where
From the corner or from the 3 stitches down? From the corner?
from the corner, from
Okay.
where you went in to start the knotless knot.
Okay, okay.
What you're going to try to do is pull this length of thread through. So you're just going to go in and go out somewhere where it won't make a mark. And your goal is to, the friction of that loop of thread will pull that little loop into in between the layers.
Worth a try. Okay, thank you.
Give that a try first.
Okay, thank you.
MarLa, how about you?
So I have finally got my frame finished, and if you can see this end of it, it is not square. This end of it, it's not square.
How not square?
It is this end, the side of this one is, of this end is not as long as this end.
Okay, that might have been a measurement thing. And you're talking about the side on the inside edge or on the outside edge?
Just the view of it, it's it kind of, it's hard to tell, isn't it, in the picture, because I can't hold the bottom.
I think I saw it, how one side was a little more slack than the other, maybe?
It's this side is shorter than this side. So it's just a little bit out of square.
Why don't you, so, and you believe it may be too out of square to proceed? Is that the concern?
I just wanted to let you know and wonder if the process of easing the face in could resolve that.
So will you take a piece of paper and write down in whatever way makes sense to you, front top, front right, front left, front bottom, back top, and so all 8 sides, and then measure the inner length. So that's going to be where that chalk line that you would fold under is. So you're going to measure the seam allowance length, and then you're going to measure the outside length. So you're going to end up with 8 rows and 2 columns of measurement. And and I'd just like to see that, because if it's just if you just have like really sensitive eyes to things not being square, but it's only 2 millimeters, that's fine. But if it's 6 millimeters, we might, or more, we might think about options then. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And then I also have another question that, don't let me forget this, is I probably can get this from the video, but what is the first set of sewing where you start to use the invisible or the hidden knots?
The frame, when you're attaching, so once you start doing this edge, or sorry, these edges here where you're attaching the frame to the face.
Okay.
That's going to be the first ones where you start.
So it's not on the corners.
No, the corners, because you have access to the back side, it's still, you can still do those knots. There's a couple of points where you do it so that they can't be felt, but those are going to be under the corner, the squares, the tricky little squares.
Oh, okay.
Those knots are all going to live under there, so you couldn't hardly feel it to begin with.
Okay. I love how the squares are not officially called the squares anymore. They're the tricky little squares. Everyone calls them. I think we should give them an acronym, TLSs, the TLSs. Thank you.
TLSs, okay, yeah. Well, we'll have to.
That's my offering to the group today is a acronym. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, MarLa. Julia, how about you?
I wasn't sure I was going to make it today, so I've done a little bit beforehand. So I've actually managed to sew onto the silk and sew onto the front. So I've done my first line of stitches. I've got one little corner that's a little bit out of sync, and I can't understand why, because on each one they're marrying up. It's marrying up on the corners. But it's just a little bit out. It's couple of millimeters difference when I'm measuring the width of the border. But we were having a little discussion beforehand about saying, can we live with a tiny imperfection on the grounds that we're not God?
Yeah.
So we can't be perfect.
Do you, well, that is the question. Can you live with it? Is it, so let me ask you just a test or two. So is it structurally sound? Do you believe that? Yeah.
Yes, totally.
Okay. And is it visually apparent now that even knowing that it's there, holding it up at arm's length away from you, I can't hardly tell over video, but for you, if you hold it at arm's length, can you see it?
Where it might show is when the little tiny square goes on the corner.
How would
I
it
think
show?
that's where it might show slightly.
So when attaching the squares, it's done relative to the corner.
Right.
So you're going, each time you're going to be measuring against where that stitch actually is. So perhaps you might see it relative to its neighbor up above, but I use the language split the difference, or often to describe, you know, if this would end up 2 centimeters or 2 millimeters to the right of this one, maybe just do 1 millimeter to the right. And so you'll have a millimeter of that difference here visible between this different distance, and then one between, you know, this distance, if that's clear.
Yeah.
And that should be hard to spot. You'd really need to be down there with a ruler. And if you walk in and someone has your Rakasu on the floor with a ruler against it, well, I don't know if you should take their judgment too seriously, because they're, you know, who does that, right? Who's going to take a ruler to someone else's Rakasu?
So I'm happy to live with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
as long as it is structurally sound. I think that's the biggest test.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll go on and do my other 2 lines around the outside.
So
Thanks.
wait, so remind me which phase. So you've sewn all of the in.
I've done the inner. I've attached the inside to the frame, but I haven't done the next 2 lines.
Okay. That's what you meant by 2 lines. I thought you meant, gotcha. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. So the midline and the border line is the next 2 steps for me.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you for clarifying. Sounds like they're in a good place.
Thanks.
Oh, everybody's moved. Sue, I think you were next.
I'm learning a lot about myself. So that saying, more haste, less speed, is one I'm really embodying at the moment, and self-forgiveness, because I'm away a lot, I've been trying to catch up, and then I realized in my efforts to catch up, I'd made a really bad goof and only put 4 panels in, so I've had to undo it all again, start again. So yeah, felt a bit silly with myself about that one. So I've unpicked it all and corrected it, and so I'm still trying to catch up, but slowly and patiently, hopefully. I do have a question. Before I realised what the silly mistake I'd made was I'd started on the surround, and it said that there are horror marks, and I can't see them on my surround, on my edging, and I can't see any measurements to measure where they should be. So I think, because there are several lines on the piece, I'm not sure if it's where it's been creased up, where it's been folded or what. So I need to mark it again. And I don't know how to do that, what measurement to go by.
So it has the chalk marks, but it does not have the hera marking. Is that correct?
It doesn't have chalk marks on.
Okay, so more than likely, so you're talking about the frame,
isn't it? I was calling it the edging. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the frame is unique to every Rakasu. So you do have, there is a method for how to measure and mark the frame. We have videos on that process, but let me explain it again here briefly, because there are others who are getting up close to it, and some folks would rather not have to rely on the video.
I see. Are you speaking about the frame worksheet?
Yes, that's right.
Oh, I don't have that anywhere, and I printed everything off that I saw on the. That's where I've been confused then.
Because you didn't have this worksheet.
No, I don't.
But it sounds like you know where it might be posted.
Well, I don't. No, I don't.
Let me
I only
share it.
realized it was missing. Okay.
So I'm on the Appamada website, and I'm going to send the link in the chat for this group, but for anyone who's trying to follow along that doesn't have access to the chat record, if you go to the appamada.org website, and then you go to groups, and then you go to Sewing Buddha's Robe, on the right-hand side under instructions, there is a link for Rakasu frame, and it should open what looks very similar to what I have on camera. And
Would you like me to just do that process briefly on shared screen, John?
Sure. Yeah, why not? I can also do it as easily. In fact, it might be easier since I'm already spotlit.
Okay, I'll make you co-host and then you can do it. There you go, John.
I need permission.
I've given you permission, John.
That's good. I think I probably should have.
So sometimes the visuals, much kind of.
Yes, it can be valuable. So let me make this full screen. So if you're on Appamada's website and you go to this groups tab, which is the only step that I've skipped so far. So if you just click this groups link and then go to Sewing Buddha's Robe here, it may not be on the left on mobile, but it should be pretty well visible. In this section is where pretty much all the resources we use can be found. And this one is going to be the frame worksheet. Okay. Thank you for suggesting that.
Okay.
So
thank you, John. That makes so much more sense. I realize I'm missing out on them.
Yeah, working in without all the pieces available to you is not. It makes for a hard time.
Yeah, yeah.
Since you haven't had a chance to review it, I will briefly explain the basic method of how you do this. So the measurements you see here in pencil are real and live. They were from the Rakasu that I just, the one I've been sewing here with the class. Those were real measurements taken off my Rakasu. So the step just prior to, let me change a camera setting real quick. So the step just prior to this, and have you redrawn your square or your seam allowance yet, Sue?
No, I haven't, because I put the last time after the last session you had mentioned, the last session I came to, which was a fortnight ago. I messaged Lynn and said, you know, what's the right measurement for the piece?
Mm-hmm.
And she sent me a copy of the materials, and she says, does that help? I said, I don't know, I haven't got time to do it just now. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't know there was one missing, so I I haven't measured. I didn't know those measure. No, I haven't.
Sure.
measured. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Well, that's perfect then. I don't think I've actually explained this step with the new cohort, so this is just fine. So imagine this did not already have the frame on it.
Yeah.
And you have attached all 5 panels. So there's a step in the instructions that describes going about and redrawing the seam allowance that goes all the way around your entire face piece. Because of variation that can happen, in how much fabric gets folded under, or perhaps the original measurements were slightly skewed for whatever reason, the distance between this seam allowance line and this seam allowance line, may be different from panel to panel. So you end up with this kind of jagged, wonky looking seam allowance from your original sewing. Perhaps the oil and moisture of your hands has worn off that seam allowance. So there is a step where you go and you making sure that that is a perfectly square, new, fresh rectangle. That step is what I'm about to describe. So start with, choose a corner. I recommend one of the bottom corners because they are more visible, less hidden by straps. And on one of these bottom 2 corners, that is going to kind of be your starting point, your source of truth about what is going to be square in this exercise. And if you have a long enough square that would actually get all the way from each corner, that's fine. If not, you can use a straight edge in addition to your square. And you're going to start there, and you're going to just mark that line here and here. You're going to mark those 2 seam allowances, which actually should be right where these stitches are. That's where you're going to be sewing. This seam is going to be sewn to that seam allowance line that we're drawing as I speak. So choose a corner and then you might even make a little mark in the seam allowance itself that indicates that this is the starting corner. And draw at least this little square here so that you can line your square up again. And then draw out this line here. And there's going to be, there's 3 different ways to check square and do what makes the most sense to you. And also try combining techniques, doing multiple techniques. On one technique, so draw out this whole line, and you can even go all the way to the edge. So you're not trying to find the first measurement now. So you can use this square and then switch. I'm rotating it for effect, but you can then switch to this corner and find square here. You can make sure that the measurement from here to here is exactly equal to the measurement from here to here. And the measurement from here to here is exactly equal to the measurement from here to here. And then finally, and this is always 100% of the time because of like trigonometry or something, there's the distance from, none of my tools are long enough here, this will work. The distance from this corner to this corner should, on a square rectangle, with all 4 corners being 90 degrees, should match the distance from this corner to this corner. So starting in one corner and drawing out one line and drawing out another line, you know that that is 90 degrees using your square. With that as your point of reference, begin to work out where those other lines are going to be, either by using the cross corner measurement, maybe as your final check, the length of the sides, whatever technique makes the most sense to you. I think at this phase, it might be valuable to under-explain and allow you to explore how you find square at this phase. That might be valuable to you because normally students discover this during the measurement phase. They figure out kind of how to work with fabric and make things square. But because remote folks, y'all haven't had the chance to measure your fabric yet, this step can prepare you for when you're working with that frame worksheet. because you're going to need to know how to work square there. So have I given you enough of a scaffold to start with?
Oh,
I'm sorry, no, it's Sue.
that's brilliant, Jon. Thank you. I don't know how I've managed to miss all that, but that makes so much sense. Do I do that before I based on the interface?
No, you can do that after. There's the instructions listed in one order or another, but it does not matter until you get to the frame measurement and marking step.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Yeah, sorry to have taken so much time.
No, this is great. This, like I said, this cohort has not been on video for this cohort. Once you have that square drawn, take one last set of measurements, and that's what you're going to, those pencil markings in that frame worksheet, which I have hidden from myself. That's what these penciled in measurements are. Hello, focus.
Okay.
And this is less for you, so I'm gonna explain just a little bit more. It sounds like you've got it, but just for the sake of video. These measurements are just the distance. These are exactly what I've measured from the corner to corner of those seam allowance lines on the inside of that seam allowance. And so then that will feed into being part of this longer running set of measurements. So you're going to have a line at 1 centimeter. This corner for this little X will be marked at 4.2 centimeters from that previous line. Then 27 centimeters further, you're going to mark another line. You can see above this that I've got a running total. That running total, and probably sum it a few times before you actually start marking, just to make sure it's easy to miss a single centimeter here or there. That, you know, measure twice, cut once type of a principle. That's what, if you don't pick up your ruler at any time as you're going, at least until you get to the end of your meter stick, that is going to be, so first I'm going to try to get it all on screen. So I'm going to mark it 1, mark it 5.2, I'll mark it, and now it's off the screen, but 32.2, I'll mark it 40.6, 56.7, 65.1. That way, when I have a pencil in one hand, a ruler in another, and a very unwieldy piece of long fabric underneath me, I'm not having to do math. I'm simply marking the numbers that I've already figured. And that should be, does that help as well, Sue?
It does, thank you. That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Jon.
Okay, and there are, like I said, there are videos where I really do a deep dive on this as well. I believe Hilary hasn't gone yet. Hilary, and then I think Maria knows the last two. Hilary, would you go do the honors?
Yes, please, because can't really progress. I'm way behind everybody else, and I'm struggling with trying to take in what you're talking about when I'm not even there yet. So I'm playing catch up on the videos. Anyway, that's where I've got to. So following the video from the week before last, I followed the instructions for pinning the interface. And see, look, it came out flat after me showing it you last week, and you going, well, what are you doing?
I don't even remember. It looks great now.
Yeah, so all my seam allowances, all the chalk lines fit, you know, they line up with one another, so I won't need to redraw them. But some of them are frayed a bit, so there's not much of the seam allowance left. So I'm being really careful with that. So when I come to sew this with the running stitch, how close to the, I've just dropped my needle on the floor, how close to the chalk line at the edge of the seam allowance can I get?
I'd say leave at least 3 millimeters from the, so I mentioned just previously, if you were listening, when I was talking with Sue, that, you know, you might have these jagged, misaligned seam allowance lines because one was, 2 millimeters shorter than another. And so the longest one, the one that is the furthest out towards the edge, about 3 millimeters from that one, I would say, which should put you more or less right in the middle.
My seam allowances are all lined up. My chalk lines are all lined up, but my seam allowances are not all the same size. So say one of them that's frayed a lot is only just 4. And if you take off all, if I were to cut off all the frayed bit, it would be nearer 3. So
really,
I don't want to move everything in because I've got a couple where they're frayed.
Okay, I would say try to stay 2 millimeters away then.
2, I can do 2. Yeah.
Definitely want at least 1 millimeter of unfrayed material. You want your stitch to get at least 1 millimeter, hopefully 2, towards the end. But you also don't want this to be visible. Do you have the matching thread? Is that what you're doing this with? It's kind of become more optional with this phase.
I do, John. I messaged Julia while I was sort of waiting and asked if this was where you use the matching thread, and she said yes. I have got the matching thread, so I'll be doing that.
So that's going to give you some.
Yeah,
that gives you some. That can that reduces a lot of my concern about how close you get to the edge, because if it's very slightly visible from from an angle, no one will notice it, which is still unlikely.
Yeah, because that's the seam allowance. So hopefully everything within that seam allowance won't be seen. That's the hope.
That's right. Yes.
So when I have done this and I've got my interface sewn on with that running stitch, then I put the silk on the other side of the interface.
That's right.
Do I trim the interface at all?
Yes.
You can see how much overlap there is. Do I trim it?
So that looks like the correct amount of overlap. You probably won't require any trimming, except for you do trim the corners. So you're going to take off. You're going to take off about that much corner.
Yeah.
So maybe a millimeter or centimeter and a half square, and that is to help it fit in the corner of the frame when it comes time. But you actually want the interface to reach all the way to the edge of the frame if possible. So 4.2 millimeters from the seam allowance line to the edge of the interfacing is what you will eventually. So you said you tend to listen when I explain the next steps. Were you listening for my explanation to Sue just now?
Yes, but I stopped becoming able to follow it because I'm so far behind. So
understood.
Yeah.
So I was describing how to draw that new square rectangle. The next step after that, and Sue, I'm sorry for forgetting this. You do, or I guess rather it's not related to the frame, but once you have redrawn a new seam allowance line that is square, you're going to measure 4.2 millimeters from the edge, or 4.2 centimeters from that seam allowance line. And at that time, you may trim off a little bit of interfacing. I have not known anyone to do it with the measurements we use. I've not known anyone need to do it, but that would be the phase where you would do trimming if needed. But you've got quite a ways to go before you get there, so you can ask again.
So a supplementary question: the silk that I've got has got creases at odd angles. Can I iron the silk before pinning it?
Yes, and there's a way. So, how deep are the creases? Are they gentle or are they pretty pronounced? Okay, yeah, those are pretty pronounced. Try just a regular silk temperature first.
Okay.
If that fails, does your sewing or does your iron have the spray feature?
Yes, it does.
So lightly wet the entire silk piece, then iron it at silk temperature continuously until it is completely dry. Some of the corners will curl up. Once they do, flip it over and start ironing the other side. And then the other corners will curl up. That's just the way fabric behaves. and keep flipping and ironing until it is completely flat again.
Oh, brilliant. Okay.
Your piece is already starched, so adding moisture and heat shouldn't disturb that starch too much.
Yeah, right. And when I attach the silk to the interface, where's my sewing line going to be? Is it going to be on top of the original sewing line, the running stitch line?
No, closer to the edge of the silk and the interfacing. So you're going to want to go around. It should fall outside of the blue material. So when on the back side, it should not catch the blue material, but ideally less than maybe 2 centimeters from that line. And there's a reason for that. But if you center it well, you shouldn't have to think about those measurements, because the measurement that was cut to should fall neatly within the dimensions I'm describing.
Okay. So when you said so less than how many centimeters? And is this, are you talking about the outer edge of the interface or the edge nearer the edge of the blue?
So I'm describing, let me just change cameras real quickly. The reason that my explanation is possibly unclear is that I've never actually explained this step with anyone in this video, in this group right now. It's something that is a new thing that I'm trying to figure out how to teach and how to make sure our measurements work for. So right now, I'm not 100% confident that this stitch does not go through my silk. That means that if my silk gets damaged or wears out faster than the rest of the fabric, all of these garments are fully repairable. There are methods to repair just one edge of a frame, just the silk, just the face. And if you need to replace the silk, it's very helpful that it's not stitched through this line and it's only stitched through this line. So you can remove this line of stitches and the squares, peel it up, remove your running stitch to the interfacing, and then insert new silk.
Okay.
So that is why I was saying, so this line, this stitch should roughly match where the stitch is on the other side. So the distance from here to here should be about 2 centimeters. The seam, and then the running stitch that you're going to do should be right around here. So outside of the blue fabric, but less than 2 centimeters away. Unfortunately, I haven't figured out a way to communicate how exactly you measure that, how exactly you check against that. So maybe once you do your initial pinning, just give this some thought and think that what I'm describing is like extra credit. If it's not, if you see a clear path forward to try to get it less than this measurement, go for it. Because you asked, I'm explaining it. But it's extra credit. If you do sew this line of stitches all the way through your silk, that's okay. Like this can be resewn if needed, if you need to replace your silk in 10 years.
It's really helpful, John. Thank you.
Glad.
Thank you. That's all my questions. Thank you so much.
Very good. You got a fire hose. You asked for a simple question, and I gave you a lot.
Thank you.
All right. Last but not least, Maria.
Hi, John. Well, I've cut the straps out. So I've cut the straps out and pinned it, and I've got the interfacing measured out. It seems to have some. Oh, it's that bit of cotton that I used to measure. The bit that works, and I've cut my interfacing out. So I'm assuming I just pin the 2 sides of the straps, fold them over and pin them. Like
Exactly line to line, if I remember correctly.
Just to line them up and make sure they're steady.
Yeah, you pin them line to line, and that are your. I forget at this phase. Is it Herod? It's not Herod, but that's okay. Yeah, pin line to line. Have you done that? It looked like you did. You had a seam allowance with.
I've done it on one of them and I've just started the other. So I'm pinning line to line because I assume you do that so you get your stitching in the exact place.
You do that so it's perfectly aligned, yeah, and then stitch outside of that. You're not going to be stitching on that line. One thing I recommend is when that 7 centimeters in the center, that's not pinned, they say, I recommend, so the line to line, I suggest doing it just as you did, doing it long ways along the fabric, and then use 2 vertical pins to mark where that middle 7 centimeters is.
Right.
And that way you'll know exactly where, because if you're in the flow of a running stitch, it can be easy to go through that by mistake. So I recommend doing those vertical ones just so it's very clear.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And so I'd do that and then do a running stitch along. It talks about ends and corners and it talks about interfacing. And I'm assuming this week I'll stitch them and get onto I mean, where does the interfacing come in?
After you've done the first running stitch. So the first running stitch is the one I recommend you really focus on the precision, that it is consistently 2 millimeters outside that sewing line.
In the hem allowance, in the seam allowance, within that, but 2 millimeters away from the line. Yeah.
Right. And try to make it fairly tight, no longer than a centimeter running stitch, ideally just 5 millimeters, 4 millimeters. So a pretty small running stitch. In fact, if you want to go as small as 2 millimeter running stitch, by all means, knock yourself out. I think if I had to pick a single number, maybe 4 millimeters.
Is that the only stitch that's going to hold that?
No, so there's a second line of stitches that will be further into the seam allowance than that, and that's going to be where you attach that interfacing. You're going to attach that with another running stitch, but that one can be less precise. It can wobble a little bit, and it can be a little wider because it's primarily holding the interfacing in place as opposed to holding the seams together. So that first one is the one that you're focusing on it being straight and then it being clean.
So hang on, just to clarify, so you've got that one that goes 2 millimeters out. So where am I stitching the interfacing? I'm assuming that'd be outside of that line again, would it, if we're not going to see it?
Outside of which line?
You know the line you do that's going to be the neat seam?
Yes, outside of that.
And would my interfacing be stitched kind of outside of that?
It would be stitched outside of that, and
gosh, just try to get my head around it.
Yeah, it might be easier to see once you've got that first line of stitches down.
Yeah.
Because so you know that first you sew both the end and all the way along, except for that middle 7 centimeters, and then you do the interfacing, and then you turn the whole thing inside out, and the kind of outside borders will be close to where you've turned it inside out. I don't really have a great example for this phase, unfortunately, at the moment.
I might be able to find some photographs somewhere on the Rakasu photograph thing, I think.
Yeah, and that email that you sent to Claire and I, you might use that yourself as a reference.
Yeah, could actually. Yeah, I never thought of that.
It's once you get going, it's pretty clear, or becomes more clear as you go. It's harder to visualize because you're turning it inside out at some phase, and you know, that's common in sewing, but it's not common in most of the rest of the world. So if you don't sew much, that can be hard to visualize.
Yeah. So do the corners come in after you've done the running stitch, sewed in the interfacing?
Yeah,
The end,
that
the
is
end, the end bits.
a good question. The I believe it makes most sense to do it in this order. So it's you start off with it completely flat, right? You have as you just held it up, you had it completely flat. So you sew your 2 millimeters outside of the seam allowance. You sew that line. You sew a long line with that 7 millimeter gap or 7 centimeter gap, and you do the ends. So you have these two lines stitched. Then you will hold the interfacing. Let me switch cameras. Okay, so let us pretend that this is the blue fabric. So this is that corner there. There is a running stitch that goes both along this edge and all the way along here. Pretend that this is the interfacing. So it's a little bit narrower. So what you're going to do, somewhere right along here, that's going to be where that seam allowance line is.
Yeah.
And you're going to line the interface up so that it is aligned with that seam allowance line on the outside. So you're actually going to be sewing it as you see here. I don't know what word to use, but you're going to be sewing it so that it actually extends into the seam allowance this way. And you're going to have a seam allowance. It does not go into the seam allowance at this end. Once you have sewn this piece to this piece in that seam allowance there, you'll fold that down. And then I believe at this phase, tacking under this corner is it makes sense to do it at this phase to me. So let me think about the actual order. So it's going to be, so you have these two pieces sewn to each other. So then fold this under, and I'm visualizing, yeah. Then fold this over, and then tack that corner together. I believe it's going to be harder to get the tack in, but it will make sewing this neatly and straight so much simpler that I believe it's worth doing it in this order, despite it going to be much more challenging to tack that corner once you're there. And the tack, instead of doing a loop tack, do just a couple of stitches that go, kind of go all the way up, all the way down, all the way up, all the way down, versus trying to do a loop as some people tack.
Yeah, and just to clarify, so you've got your interfacing and you've got your seam.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to be sewing it kind of like that, if you know what I mean, along like that. But you've got this seam here. So you've got this little centimetre seam, and the first running stitch I'm doing just 2 millimeters outside of that.
Mm-hmm.
And will the interfacing be sewn even further nearer this edge?
That's right.
So you don't see that seam
3
at all,
to 5. That's right. That's right. Maybe 3 to 5 from that chalk line.
Right. Yeah. So you don't even see that at all, as in a seam. Yeah.
That's right. And and once it's inverted, that seam has no risk of being seen because that previous line of stitches is already there. If you notice 2 millimeters into the edge, you should actually so this is the Rakasu that I'm actively wearing at the moment. So I can actually, let me move the chat window. MarLa, I saw your chat, by the way. So I can actually peel this open, and you can see there's that 2 millimeters of material there and 2 millimeters of material there. So it's going to be fully hidden either way. And that's because the kind of, once you invert it, it will naturally want to take the shape of the interfacing inside, which is kind of a neat magical bit that it ends up being of consistent width because of that interfacing once you invert the material. So I recommend straightness and care on that 2 millimeter inside the line step, just because, you know, just in case.
So even
But
drawing a line out maybe would be a good idea.
No, I was about to say, I stress that as a fallback, but theoretically, because of this piece of interfacing and the way it naturally wants to follow that, the interfacing goes all the way to the edge. I can feel it in there. It really is not a big concern because, as you see, it ends up fully concealed. I can peel it open and you still can hardly see it.
Yeah. Yeah. Great, that makes sense.
I'm glad for that. So yes, the first thing is going to be, as you described, you're going to do the 2 millimeter outside, then you do that next running stitch to attach the seam allowance or the interfacing, and then you'll fold over that interfacing, and then you'll tack this corner under. The tacking really is just to get you started on the inversion phase, and it probably is optional. Once you have it inverted, you'll have the opportunity to use a ruler to kind of, you know, nudge that corner back into place if it's not. And I don't think it really is that helpful to getting a neat corner there. It's much more important that the running stitch you do 2 millimeters outside the line here and here, at that corner point, making sure that that's neat and tight and strong, that there's a really strong running stitch. That's going to be far more important at getting a clean, straight edge at the end of your straps.
Yeah.
And it's still hard. Even
going for a while, isn't it? I think.
Do what?
That's going to keep me going for a while, the running stitch and then the spacing.
I think most people describe this as a surprisingly fast step, actually. And I'll be curious to see if you...
Yeah, I've noticed I've got high expectations of the task and high expectations of myself with low kind of expectations of my aptitude. It's like, I don't know if that made any sense, but it's kind of like, I'm always like, oh, I'm not going to be able to do that, you know, and it's like all a bit overwhelming. It comes together, doesn't it? Step by step, it really does. It really is surprising me how it comes together. There was just one more question I think that I had, and that was, I measured them again and again and again, the length, again and again for where it was sitting, and with the engasho, and it was 86.5 the whole thing, again and again and again. And do you think that's too short, or?
That sounds fine.
Yeah, because I just kept measuring it because I thought, well, maybe it should be 88, but it's 86.5 in total.
I think that sounds good. And if, you know, like I said, if it doesn't work out, there's more fabric in the world and we can do it again.
Oh, thank you so much, John. That's so helpful. It's got my head a lot clearer on the steps and what I'm doing. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you for grilling me on it.
Sorry.
Okay. It's for the sake of the video, right?
So John, this is where I'm at. It didn't work with trying to get the friction of the thread. That didn't work. Then I thought, well, what if I tried to pull the extra slack on the stitches themselves and sort of even out the amount of the bubble among the first 4 stitches? Mm-hmm. I think I kind of did it. You know, I probably pulled a little bit of that out, you know, so it's probably not as long as it was originally. You know what I mean?
Yeah. My concern.
Yeah. I know it's not as secure as the other corners.
Right.
It's not as secure. And it's, you know, I think,
which I'm not clear
which
on
corner?
exactly. Yeah, where
it's the main
exactly,
corner.
and
it's
is it
yeah.
But which stitch is it exactly?
Oh, it is the tip here. Right here.
Going along the top?
Yeah, going along the top.
We're in luck because that's going to get sewn over with your strap.
Okay.
right? That's your top left corner.
Oh, yes, it's my top left corner, yes. Well, I mean, if I'm wearing it, it's the right? Isn't it?
Sure, yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Either way, there's going to be a gnarly mess of stitches on top of it. So I think we dodged a bullet. I wish I'd asked you that sooner and recognized which corner it was.
That's okay. It's still, I think I made the best of it, and it'll be very secure then with the strap on.
Yes.
Okay.
Because you'll sew over, and that friction will hold that knotless knot tail in place.
Yeah. Okay. All righty. Okay. Phew. So now I'm up to the squares, and I like Maria's little paper pattern. I think I'm going to try that. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking.
Yep.
All right, MarLa, I'm looking at your measurements. Yeah, one side is definitely longer than the other.
By quite a bit. And that's one of the things on my, it's like point, I also measured the diagonals. And that's why I wish I could scan this and send it to you, because it's really illustrative when you can see the squares. Want me to keep trying to scan it?
What about the outside lengths of the sides? What are those measured to?
Okay.
And MarLa, I'm drawing it out here myself on paper. MarLa, how's it coming? How did those outside edge measurements turn out from the tips? You're muted.
I'll shoot those to you in chat. Sorry, I forgot.
That's okay.
And just so that we're on the same page about what disassembling means, is I'm removing all of the pins, all of the basting or the top stitching or whatever you want to call it, everything, so that I will have a long piece of fabric at the end.
That's right. Yeah. Don't cut any blue fabric, but remove everything else, basically.
I think I'm going to go iron this all out.
Great.
I'm thinking that where I might have gotten into trouble was when I was marking. I, at one point, accidentally did my diagonal lines through the seam allowance on one of them and had to go back and remeasure and readjust, and I thought I had it figured out, and I bet I didn't. So I also got screwed up on my hairlines for some reason. So would it be possible for me to draw chalk lines on both sides to make sure that I'm not messing up that way?
Unconventional, but I think it could be okay. It should, these chalk lines are designed to be removable. So, or that's, we use them because they can be removed. So.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, if I get my chalk lines drawn correctly, I will just be super careful with the hair at this time. I just wasn't pushing hard enough, apparently. Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead and do the chalk lines then. I think that can, but do measure your pieces to make sure that the measurements were what you expected.
It's completely rectangularly square.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, and it goes right to the middle where it's supposed to. Wow. I mean, it's yeah.
Yeah, and flip it. Will you flip it as well? Just do that. No, hold it up and then just flip it vertically, so I can see the and then just no. So flip it like this, like rotate your wrists only, and then do it again. Yeah, wow, that does look like the short sides are the same length. And they measured the same length from.
Does it look like short sides are the same length? Oh, let me measure. Oh, for goodness sake.
Yeah, that's the really key point, is to know if you've got all the fabric you need or not.
Okay.
Can I offer an unconventional tip here?
Yes.
I also would have appreciated chalk lines on the other side. So I just put chalk lines on one side, and then I used a pin and I marked that line. And then I could flip it over and see if I had it even, and that was enough without having to draw more chalk.
Using the chalk line as a, or using the pin as a visual guide.
Yes.
That makes sense. Yeah, I'll reiterate that to her when she's done measuring.
So should I be measuring from selvage to selvage or from seam allowance to seam allowance?
You're going to both, sort of. Pull out. Do you have a copy of your framework sheet handy?
Mm-hmm.
Said yes. Okay. So I would just compare and see if those measurements are exactly the same as the ones.
Okay.
That's a good idea. I'm going to take note of your suggestion, Shelley.
Measuring from selvage to selvage or from seam allowance to seam allowance?
You're going to both, sort of. Pull out. Do you have a copy of your framework sheet handy?
Mm-hmm.
Said yes. Okay. So I would just compare and see if those measurements are exactly the same as the ones.
Okay.
That's a good idea. I'm going to take note of your suggestion, Shelley.
Okay. John, I've realized that what I'm sewing the face onto the interface. It's not exactly in the center of the interface. It's like a 1/4 of a centimeter bigger, wider on one side than on the other, or an 1/8 of a centimeter wider on one of the narrow sides than the other.
So
Does
it's
that
not
matter?
centered.
No, I mean, I centered the center of the pin exactly for the center of the face, and I hadn't realized that I also had to get it exactly in the center of the interface. And I measured, so I'm not quite sure how I got it wrong.
What are you using as the reference for the differences that you're talking about?
When I'm measuring from seam allowance line, like the seam
Mhm.
allowance line there, to the outer edge of the interface, on one side, from there to the edge of the interface is an 1/8 of a centimeter wider than the other side. That's on the narrow, on the narrow rather than the length. And on the length, one side is 2 centimeters, sorry, not 2 centimeters, 1/4 of a centimeter wider than the other side in terms of the overlap, how much of the interface is showing.
Do any of them exceed 4.2?
4.2 what?
Centimeters.
That would be that much, wouldn't it, between my fingers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm
No.
asking if...
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
So I'm asking about the distance from here to here.
From the outer edge of the interface to the seam allowance.
Yeah.
2, 3, 4. One side's exactly 4, slightly under 4, and the other side is 1, 2. That's not right. One's 4, and the other side from the seam allowance is 4.5.
Okay. Go ahead and recenter then in that case. The other option is to
unstitch it basically.
How much have you stitched at this point?
I've stitched one long side and most of a short side, but I'll undo it and get them exactly right, because it's so the overlap should be 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 4 on one side. It's 1, 2, 3, 3 3/4 of a centimeter on the other side. Those are the heights.
Those short sides.
The sides. Okay. And the other on the top and the bottom the bottom is 1, 2,
4.5.
4.5 centimeters, and the top is 1, 2, 3, exactly 4. So I'd have to move it a quarter of a centimeter, wouldn't I?
You can either move it a quarter of a centimeter or simply plan on cutting that in the future, trimming that interfacing. And the reason I'm offering that is because, so the 4.2 is it's only a guidepost. It's not a precise thing. It may not, yours may not end up as 4.2 precisely. That is the goal, but it's not always the case. And then the other reason is so 4.2 times 2 is 8.4. Your measurements of exactly 4 and 4.5 is 8.5, which is larger than 8.4. So you may have trimming even if you adjust this. You may have to trim. So knowing that trimming is a possibility, even if you do your best to adjust, in knowing that you might have to trim anyways, we could simply choose to move forward now, knowing you will have to trim with certainty on that longer edge, on that bottom edge. That's 4.5.
Okay.
I think that's going to be the course of action that we should take.
And at the sides, it's
Shoulder, some by some,
it's
3.8.
4 virtually on one side, and this is to the seam line, and 3 3¾ on the other. So it's tiny. Moving it's going to be quite hard. I would have thought it's tiny on that one.
Yeah, I say let's keep going, and then just know, you might even mark in that seam allowance somewhere, or in that interfacing somewhere, you just make a little mark to remind yourself to that you will need to cut it.
Okay, thanks, John.
Of course, thank you for asking. Relief.
It's hard. It's hard.
It is. It is hard.
John, I just forgot to ask which thread I'm using for the straps to do the running stitch.
Matching thread. That's the one point where I think matching is really important, and I insist on it.
So that's the 315, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
I trust the calibration you've done with your fellow UK sewists. I'm not, the one that I used was a different number, but I don't have it with me.
Yeah, I think that's 315 for me. Thank you.
John, can I also ask you one last question?
Yeah.
So when we're marking the distance, the half on the front of the frame, I'm doing it on the face side, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so it's about 2 centimeters, you're saying, should be.
Roughly, yes. And as I say, you can actually see on this example, maybe if I can get it all, that it's a larger distance from here to here than it is from here to here. And that's again because it's a balancing act of getting it to meet in the corners so that your 2 lines create that corner. It's a balancing act of that and being equidistant.
Okay. Thanks again.
You're welcome.
John, it's Hilary. I think it's slightly crooked as well. I'm going to undo all the stitches, unpin it, and have another go.
Okay.
Because I think when I was lining it up, I wasn't necessarily lining it up with the seam allowance chalk line. I was lining it up with itself, its edge, its edges.
Yeah, so if I introduced error when I was measuring and marking, or if your seam allowances are different, or that the frayed edge, that could have done it too.
Yeah, it's the frayed edge really. And so when I sew it again, when I do the running stitch again, is it small running stitches?
This one, I think it's not essential to be small, but because you're going to, this will be the structural stitch. The actual namukebutsu will be a structural stitch that connects it all. So bow once to the altar and once to each other. Thank you all. I'm so glad to see you're all making such great progress. It's just, we're doing great.
Thank you. I'll see you in 2 weeks, everybody. I won't be here next week. I'll miss you guys.
Oh, we'll miss you, Rosemary.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, John.
Good to
Happy
see you.
sewing, everybody.
Yes, happy sewing.
See you all soon.